I was asked to prepare a kind of a presentation or talk about the subsidizing of homeownership in Canada. And I was sent a couple of questions, which are just, loose questions to kind of think about. And these are the questions here. So the questions, do all levels of government subsidize homeownership, or is it one level in particular? I'm going to talk about that. There are different levels that subsidize homeownership in different ways. Is it just the tax system, or are there direct payouts? There are direct payouts and grants and forgivable loans and this kind of thing. So there is that, but the tax system also is important. But one thing that isn't mentioned in that sentence are the effective subsidies to the private lending system, which the federal government is involved in, and it's a really important one from my perspective, anyway. And this is why I think having other people on the panel who research different aspects would potentially also be good, because I'm very much focused on this, but I do think it has a big effect, and that is on the financialization of homeownership, which I would argue has led to the financialization of rental as well. The other question is, what would you estimate the total or overall outlay is, homeownership versus renting? That's a really big empirical question. We don't have the answer to that, so I've kind of put it in purple here, but I will come back to a slide that gets at that in a little bit, maybe. And then this question about the kind of push and pull of housing policy, and I've kind of spent my evening yesterday preparing a little chart. So I'll get through this and then let me know if you have any questions. So subsidies are quite diverse, and really the state and various levels of the state in Canada have been for many years involved in subsidizing homeownership. Maybe the one place to start are the first-time buyers programs. Some of these are more recent, some of these are long-standing. The home buyers tax credit, that's a relatively recent phenomenon. The Liberal government promised to increase that. I don't think that they have yet, but they did promise to do that in the last election. But you could already receive a non-refundable tax credit up to $1,500 if you're a first-time buyer. There's a GST and HST rebate on eligible purchases by eligible buyers. There's a home buyers plan, which allows people to withdraw money from their RSP. It was $35,000. It's soon going to be $60,000 once the legislation goes through, without any tax penalties. You have to repay it within 15 years. And the first home savings account, which was created by the Liberals, promised in the last election and created, one of the first things that they did. This allows first-time buyers to to save money in this type of savings account. When they put the money in, they are able to reduce their taxes by that amount. And then when they take it out, there's no tax payable. So it's kind of a tax giveaway to first-time buyers on both ends. It's actually, in my opinion, a very inequitable, measure, because it allows the children of wealthy parents, the children who earn decent money, and of wealthy parents who also earn decent money, to get major tax exemptions, whereas it doesn't really help anybody else. So I actually think it was like probably the worst of the promises that the Liberals made, and it was one of the first things that they did. It really benefited wealthy middle class and wealthy homeowners or home buyers. And then there are so that's mainly, those are federal plans. Then there's a bunch of provincial first-time home buyers programs. In Ontario, first-time buyers can get up to $4,000 off the land transfer tax. And the land transfer tax is typically well over $4,000, and this is for properties valued at $380,000 or so. And most properties that people would be buying would be, condos, whatever, would be more than that. So basically, it gives $4,000 to eligible first-time buyers. You just have to be Canadian citizen, 18 and up, and it's your first home, etc. So that's a provincial program. A lot of the provinces have similar programs. I think Ontario's is a little bit richer than others, but they often have this. So there's quite a lot of demand side measures targeted to first-time buyers to let them get into the housing market and compete with established property owners. So that's one way that there's a lot of money going out the door that subsidizes that. Then there's the provincial and federal tax system. One of the key ones is the mortgage interest tax exemption for investment properties. This is really a big giveaway to speculators. The intention is to entice investment into second properties that are then rented out. This has also been coupled recently with measures that penalize anyone who has an empty home, and so it really is trying to get people to put these on the long term and or potentially short term market, but long term now. And but this is a major tax giveaway to those who own second properties, and that includes those who own cottages, but particularly those who, you know, get a condo unit or whatever, or multiple to rent out. So this really this promotes speculation, risky behavior. That is, promotes like buying as expensive as a second property as you can afford, and that's so you're investing in it for the capital gain as well as for the rent that you might get out of the second property. Another way that homeownership is subsidized is a capital gains inclusion rate, which is less than 100%. You might have been reading about this. It was 50% for many years, and the Liberal government in their last budget said that as of June 25th, it'll go to 66% for anything above 250,000. This means that if you had a second property and it increased in value substantially more than 250,000, then the amount above that would be included in the calculation for tax payable at 66%. Now, anything less than 100% means that there's a tax-free element there. So, you have a second property, you make $1 million on the sale, and the first 250,000 you only pay tax on half of that, and then after 250 you pay tax on 66%, which means that you're, I don't know exactly what the math would be, but it's like substantial portion of the profit is just completely tax-free. So that also it incentivizes investment into second properties. This is often this can be used by businesses, firms, etc., but also by amateur landlords who buy a couple of extra units, and it's meant to entice them to do that with the idea that other types of investments would be taxed at a higher rate. But this does promote that kind of speculation in property. Of course, there's no capital gains tax exemption on primary residence. And until recently, there was no tax at all on assignment sales. It's only about just over a year ago that that the current government added a tax on assignment sales. So if you purchased a pre-construction condo on spec that wasn't going to be built for 5 years, you purchase it when it was put on sale. Sometimes, many times, the units are offered to a select invite-only crowd, like real estate agents and this kind of thing, or other investors. You purchase one of those things. 5 years later, the whole thing is worth double. You sell the assignment before it's even built to someone else because the market value has gone up, and you wouldn't pay any tax on that sale, on the capital gain of that sale. Sometimes people were buying these, with only like 20,000 down, 40,000 down, and then making, crazy amounts of money, $500,000, et cetera. And there was no tax. So they've, thankfully they've added assignment sales. Those are now taxed at, the capital gain. This encouraged flipping, as you might guess, and a lot of speculation too. Now, the last couple of years, the federal government realized that this had become a business for a number of speculators, and they determined that if you were doing this as a business, not as like a individual home owner, like maybe or but if you were doing this kind of regularly, then you would be taxed at the assignment sale would be taxed as a business kind of transaction. But for many years, it wasn't taxed at all like that. So many people made literally millions of dollars doing this kind of thing. And so that encouraged speculation in real estate, which was geared for the homeownership market, like the condo sector, even though, behind the scenes, people knew that these condos were being built by developers to be bought by speculators to be let out. And it became, the new supply of rental housing. But it was, it's officially geared to the homeownership market. And then there's provincial tax exemptions. The provinces also provide mortgage interest tax exemptions. So those things apply as well to federal and provincial. But the provinces also have a number of tax exemptions and even forgivable loans for home improvements and renovations. If you claim that you are adding a second unit because you want your elderly parent to move in, or if you're making renovations so that people with disabilities, with a wheelchair, whatever, can access the property, then you often would get a tax exemption and or a forgivable loan. These often add value to properties, and then those values then can be realized upon sale. And so this was, a way of subsidizing the increase in the value for homeowners. So that's the federal and provincial tax system. The municipal tax system also provides a number of subsidies. One basic issue is that property taxation at the municipal scale, the rates are lower for homeowners than incorporated business and also purpose-built rental buildings. So many people know this. But of course, municipal services typically are geared to homeowners because homeowners are the ones that vote. And if you don't, live or own property in a municipality, then you can't vote in it. So incorporated businesses usually, often don't vote in municipal politics. So the policies that municipalities develop and the services they develop are often geared to homeowners, but they want to keep homeowners' taxes down so that they get elected, which means that homeowners pay a lower share of the cost of the services they use than do other land uses in municipalities, often lower than renters. Some say this means that renters pay higher property taxes through their rent, but that's actually debated. But this is often a claim that is made, or justification for leveling the property tax rates between different types of land uses. And then many municipalities have property tax exemptions or generous phase-ins of property tax increases. And that often is for seniors or those who are living in a municipality for a long time and or those who have disabilities. So there's different provisions in different municipalities. Sometimes these provisions are just those, there for people who have been living in the municipality for more than 20 years or something like that. Which means that more of the tax burden is placed on younger households or more recent households. And this means typically more indebted households because as values have increased, anybody who has purchased a home in the last 10 years is paying a lot more, and increasingly, especially in the pandemic. And we'll get a bit into that too. Sometimes these programs have no income criteria whatsoever, right? So, whether you own a $5 million home or you own a $300,000 condo, the same, property tax phase-in or exemption might apply. That's something that's true in Vancouver. And it's been said this is one of the reasons why wealthy people like to go to Vancouver, because if they're, they retire in Vancouver or something, if they're a senior, then they can often phase in over many years any property tax increase and pay much less, which means that everybody else is paying a higher tax rate than those wealthy seniors. So that's an issue that has been on the radar in Vancouver, but each different municipality has a different criteria. Ontario allows for deferred land transfer tax, as well as deferring the education portion of property taxes for low-income seniors and lower-income households, especially when someone has a disability. You might say that that's a bit more equitable than what happens in Vancouver, but that also means that other households are paying a higher share of taxation. So those are the different ways that the municipal and the tax system and the provincial and federal tax system operate. There's, of course, there might be a few quirks in here, special programs in certain municipalities, but that's the general landscape. Another thing that happens, and this is generally off the radar for many who are looking at the inequities between renters, the rental sector, and home ownership, is the way that mortgage lending has been subsidized and backed by particularly the federal government. This is something that I've been studying. So again, this is something that I would focus on and like to highlight more than potentially some of the other. I think this is a really important issue, and it's, I think, the main cause of the bubble, including during the pandemic. So the federal government guarantees, that is, insures, sometimes purchases outright mortgage issued to home buyers, not only first time, but second time, and multiple property owners, et cetera. Which means that the banks don't actually hold the mortgages; they sell them. And in many cases, what they're doing is they're selling them, or they're having them insured by the federal government. So the federal, quote, taxpayer. I don't like using that term so much because, but this is the federal government is actually borrowing money now, so even taxpayers are not providing the money. So the federal government holds the risk. The banks don't hold the risk, and that means that the banks are willing to lend more and lend to those who otherwise would be too risky to lend to, like speculators owning multiple properties. This pushes up real estate prices because now you have many more people bidding for the same prices, especially in a rising market. The main program for this is the Canada Mortgage Bonds program. Canada Mortgage Bonds are bonds created by the federal government. They are then sold typically to pension funds, but other investors as well. And that money that they receive has to be spent purchasing mortgages from Canada's banks or lenders. So the federal government is creating a revenue stream for banks. It's taking the risk off of the banks' balance sheets, giving them more money to lend. So that means that the banks are profiting. What they do is they issue the mortgages and they sell them right away, and they sell them sometimes at a profit. And so it's in their interest to issue as large a mortgage as they possibly can, and to issue as many as they possibly can. The more they do, the more they profit in relation to their peers, pushing up their share price, et cetera. So this is a real giveaway to the banks. Now the CMBs, the Canada Mortgage Bonds, are given to guarantee the principal and interest to purchasers. So if there's a crisis and people stop paying their mortgages, it's the federal government that is on the hook. There's also some private mortgage insurers that have insured Canada Mortgage Bonds and other mortgage-backed securities in Canada, but the federal government also provides a 90% guarantee to them. It's a completely strange system. And so that means if those private insurers, people stop paying their mortgages and they're insured by those private insurers, then the federal government is still covering 90% of the loss. So it's been called the taxpayer heavy risk situation. And if that it becomes true that there's a drop in prices, people stop paying their mortgages, there's a crisis or whatever, then the federal government, they have to make whole the investors in the Canada Mortgage Bonds. So the principal and interest has to be made whole. And so they would have to go into austerity mode, cut healthcare spending, a whole bunch of other kinds of things in order to meet their obligations. So it's not a very good system. The Insured Mortgage Purchase Program, which was first instituted during the financial crisis, 2009, 2010, then directed the federal government to purchase directly from the banks when they couldn't sell the Canada Mortgage Bonds. They did that in 2000. Well, they started in late 2008, all the way through 2010, and they did it again during the pandemic, 2020 to 23, which was just a stimulus to the banks to lend as much as possible to anyone they could find because the federal government was buying them. So that, I think, personally has been the biggest factor in stimulating the bubble, driving up prices, indebting Canadians. It's been a terrible set of policies. Recently, in the fall of 2023, the federal government decided to borrow on international markets via the sale of treasury bonds, which are the typical bonds that they use when they have a deficit. And they can spend the money they receive from selling those treasury bonds on anything, including the healthcare system, et cetera. But they decided that they would take the money that they got from selling those treasury bonds and buy their own Canada Mortgage Bonds, which is a really strange policy. It means that they're taking money that is borrowed from international investors and pension funds that could be spent on anything, including covering healthcare, and converting it into money that has to be spent buying mortgages from the banks. Totally strange policy, and all it does is give the banks more profit, takes the risk off of them, and then indebts Canadians more and prevents house prices from falling. So this, I think, has been a really important subsidy to the whole home building industry, developers, et cetera. And it's really not on the radar of many people, but this is something I've been studying, and I think that it should be looked at a lot more. And it's very inequitable. Finally, There's also other ways that homeownership has been subsidized. One is through the privatization of land in Canadian cities. Uh, the federal government outside of cities actually has typically been increasing its holdings of crown land, but in cities, it's been selling off that land. And when it sells off the land, sometimes the land is used for things like transportation infrastructure and other kinds of things, occasionally for affordable housing projects. But in the vast majority of cases, it's basically sold for condo development. And this is something that a student that I'm supervising at the University of Toronto, Sean Grisdale, who many of you might know, is studying for his dissertation. He's looking at the sale of government-owned land and how it's ended up and where it's ended, and both um, the federal lands as well as the provincial lands and even municipal lands that have been privatized in Canada's large cities. He's looking at Toronto mainly, have ended up as condo developments, private condo developments. So this is another way that you could say homeownership is subsidized, in part because the land is sold at often rates that are lower than the true market value, especially the market value when the land is rezoned for high density residential. So the developers that are buying that land are buying it at effectively a discount than they might have been if it was already zoned for high density residential. So this is another way of subsidizing it. And then there's the CMHC. And this is, again, something that maybe is not on the radar of a lot of people in the housing field. The CMHC, as many of you know, is the lender of last resort when a rental uh, community gets into crisis, a co-op or whatever. But it's also been the lender of last resort if a developer gets into trouble. And the time that this was particularly true was the global financial crisis, 2008 to 2010, 2011, when a number of condo developments that had not been finished yet ran into trouble and the financing became expensive, or they couldn't access new rounds of financing. So CMHC stepped in and became a lender of last resort, allowing those to be finished. And so it steps in with that emergency funding. And again, this was a situation which allowed things to be completed, but it was really a very cheap form of insurance for developers, condo developers. And condo developers that took a risk knowing that there could be potential crisis, or they might they were basically bailed out through this way. So I put this little last kind of set of points here. Condo developers have been big benefactor from various government subsidies. The federal governments, they help first-time buyers purchase like to buy a home. Often this means a condo unit. So they're helping people buy those condo units. The federal government, this Canada Mortgage Bonds and Insured Mortgage Purchase Program, they buy mortgages from banks. So they're stimulating the banks to lend to people who might otherwise not get a mortgage at a lower rates. So that includes speculators buying condo units to sell out. So the condo developers really benefit from that. The federal and provincial governments exempt mortgage interest for second properties, again, allowing those speculators buying condo units and spurring them to buy them so that they can let out originally on Airbnb, but increasingly with the vacant home tax, trying to stimulate them to keep it on the long-term market. But nonetheless, it benefits the condo developers. A lot of the land that was privatized in big cities like Toronto has been sold and ended up in the hands of private developers, often at discounted rates. And then furthermore, in those times of crisis, like 2008, 2009, 2020, 21, CMHC stepped in providing more emergency loans to condo developers so that they could, at low rates, so that they could finish their development. So condo developers really have been hugely benefited from these kinds of subsidies. So that's something to keep in mind. So I can see looking at the chat there seems to be a few questions. I'm just going to go through this one, and then maybe I'll start taking some questions. This was a question that was asked of me. Justin Trudeau recently said housing must retain its value, a crazy, terrible thing to say from a political angle. Obviously wasn't thinking too well, especially of all the young people that voted for him in past elections. And then the question of this implies the federal government is investing to make sure houses don't get more affordable while saying we need to make home ownership more accessible. There's a tension. Are they matched by policies that push and pull as well? And how is the federal government subsidizing homeownership this way? So I made this table last night. This basically lists all of the promises that the Liberals made in the 2021 federal election, and also other measures that they have announced in the more recent period. And what I've done here is listed by column. I don't know if you can see my cursor here. In the very first left column are those policies that stimulate demand. And by stimulating demand for homeownership, they're supporting high prices. One of the problems with the federal government's approach to homeownership and to land and housing and mortgage lending, everything, is that the longer that house prices stay artificially elevated in a, you might call a bubble or whatever, the the more that the federal government is on the hook if those prices start to decline, if there's a crisis. And so the more that they are incentivized to keep prices high. And so they don't want prices to decline because they might have to go into austerity mode and cut healthcare and other kinds of things. And so keeping it at least level would be in the federal government's interest. So they come up with a bunch of policies that stimulate demand. So this includes the first home savings account, first-time buyer incentive, first-time buyer's credit. They promised to reduce CMHC insurance for first-time buyers, and then they also promised to increase the Canada Mortgage Bond Program and even direct purchase of Canada mortgage bonds. That was recently. These are all demand-side policies that support high prices. What I've done here is I've kept in sort of black ink the policies that have not gone forward or that have been canceled, and in green the ones that actually they have kept their promise and they've instituted. So that's what that's why the color coding here. In the second column are those policies which stimulate the supply of home ownership units. The effect on prices in this case may be unclear. If you increase the number of units and the demand stays the same, the idea would be that prices would moderate or they'd stabilize or decline or whatever. It's hard to know. It depends on what kind of units, et cetera. But these are policies that kind of stimulate supply. Again, I've color coded them. Then there are the third column are those policies that support tenants in some way. That is, that create new rental supply, reduce speculation or demand for ownership, which thus should allow for easier access to housing, homeownership housing, support lower prices and rents. And so there's these policies here, and again, color coded them based on whether or not the policies were implemented. And then in the last column, this is implemented. Yes, it's green. Sometimes they're partially implemented, or whether it's unclear or no. So you can kind of see here, some of these were, canceled. Some of them, it's kind of unclear. They promised to reduce CMHC insurance for new-time buyers, but in fact, they came up with a 25% reduction if you're purchasing a highly energy-efficient home, and you have to have documentation of that. So it's not really clear. That was already existing policy. They kind of folded it into this promise. Did they really, fulfill that promise or implement it? I would say it's unclear. The promise to build or revitalize 1.4, I should say million homes, not just 1.4 homes. It's also unclear there too, because of course they haven't done anything nearly like that. And it's all based on, the private sector doing it. And the private sector has been pulling out of their plans because they can't sell the price at the prices that are on offer, et cetera. But they actually have kept their promises for a number of these different policies. I put the Housing Accelerator Fund in both categories here. It's the only one that is in two, because it's meant to boost supply, of like private condos, but it's also being used to incentivize municipalities to allow for more high density rental and this kind of thing. So that is something that they are keeping their promise on. The Affordable Housing Fund, which that's the name of the fund that they are using they funded to allow the federal government to help support the purchase of rental buildings to keep them out of the private market, to help convert them to condos or community land trusts. So that's partial in the sense that they've actually only committed $1 billion. They promised more than that. But it still seems to be they finally announced it. Now what'll happen with it, who knows? Anyway, there's a bunch of other kinds of things that the federal government is doing, and so the end it's just a very complex answer to that question of the push and pull. They are trying to support prices through demand side measures, at the same time as they have been meeting some of their promises to support tenants or to support more supply or other kinds of measures. So it is really a set of policies that have a lot of tensions, and it's very unclear how all of these things together might affect the landscape of homeownership. Now, I'll just show you one more slide, and that's this. As I mentioned, have been studying the financialization of homeownership now for 15 years or so. And one of the ways that homeownership has been subsidized I put that in quotes, subsidized, is through the lending system. The federal government created the Canada Mortgage Bonds program in 2001. Again, they sell these bonds to investors. The money they receive has to be spent buying mortgages from the banks. So the federal government has created a system that otherwise would have meant that the banks kept the mortgages on, they would have been more risk averse and that kind of thing. So the federal government has, through this, provided a revenue stream for banks and stimulated them to lend more. And often that meant lending to speculators. And this is a graph showing, it's estimating the amount of state-backed lending, securitized lending that the federal government has created through these programs. This is the Canada Mortgage Bonds Program, the National Housing Act Mortgage-Backed Securities Program, which predated Canada Mortgage Bonds, and also the Covered Bonds Program, which is very, very small and really kind of insignificant, but I've included it here. It's really difficult to get at an accurate assessment of this. I was able to get an accurate assessment for a paper that I published with Brian Clifford in 2015, because the data was disaggregated for the different programs. And we can see here the first MBS program, didn't take off until the Insured Mortgage Purchase Program used it to, crank up the amount of outstanding securitized mortgage credit. The Canada Mortgage Bonds Program started in 2001 and really took off after that. Covered bonds were kind of small. And then this is the private label securitization, which really is not a big thing in Canada. And so unlike other places like the US. But the data sets for this only went to 2011 because the Harper government canceled a bunch of data collection. They of course they canceled the long form of the 2011 census, but at the same time they told StatsCan to stop collecting other kinds of information. So it became hard to do it. Bank of Canada has a very big aggregate data sets, which kind of combine everything. And so this is the best estimate that I can get from Bank of Canada data on this. But I was asked the question, how does the subsidization of homeownership compare to the subsidization of rental? And this is not a graph of the subsidization of homeownership. It's merely a graph of the amount of outstanding state-backed securitized mortgage lending. But that's one small aspect of the large kind of landscape of homeownership subsidization. But I think it's a key one. And so this graph is showing the increase in the outstanding securitized mortgage lending as of December 2019, which is the last, I think have like up to the pandemic, which is like February 2020. So I just put it to 2019 to make it clear. As of December of 2019, $327 billion was still outstanding of securitized lending. That's a ton of money. It totally, completely dwarfs any other type of federal policy. So they put that much money into the system. Without that much money in the system, land prices would be probably half of what they are right now, quite literally. Between 2007 and 2016, which is when this ramped up the most, this added roughly $1.6 billion per month of new mortgage lending that otherwise would not have existed. It's roughly $19 billion a year of money flowing into the homeownership sector. That is basically guaranteed profits for the banks because they sell those mortgages to the federal government. It imperils the federal, it's basically added to the federal deficit, although they don't, when they report the federal deficit, they don't include it there. But it basically is added to the federal deficit, which imperils their ability, their room to borrow for, other things like social housing. But particularly it stimulates demand for housing. It's a huge demand side measure. Now compare that to the federal government, which up to now spends roughly $1.9 billion a year on social housing, and the Ontario government, which actually basically gives money to the municipalities to spend the money, City of Toronto, et cetera. But through their municipalities, their program spends roughly $2.8 billion a year on social housing subsidies. The federal government is planning through the National Housing Strategy to spend roughly $4 billion a year. So they want to increase that from $1.9 billion to roughly $4 billion. So, but think of it, $4 billion, Ontario, if the municipalities are spending 2.8, the province is spending about 2.8 billion. So, across the country, we're probably looking at about 8 billion from the provinces, 4 billion from the federal government. So even if they are able to max out their intentions, provided that we don't have a change of government and Liberals are able to do what they say they're going to do, we're probably looking at maybe 12 billion spent on social housing in all its kind of various forms. Compare that to about 19 billion a year of money flowing through into the homeownership sector. So that's, it's not a subsidy in the usual sense, but the federal government has created this program which gives the huge stimulus incentive to the banks to lend. And the government ends up buying those mortgages. And so it is, I would kind of put it in the same category as a subsidy, which means that really it does dwarf even the direct funding of various kinds of social housing cooperatives and everything else that the provinces and the federal government, is engaged in. So, okay, so I took longer to say all this than I expected, but hopefully that kind of gets at some of the questions that you were hoping to ask. And I have other slides I can show you in relation to other questions, but maybe what I'll do is end it now and let you ask me the questions you want me to answer.
Thanks, Alan. That's a lot of information and really interesting. There's a couple of questions that have come through while you were talking. So the first is Shakira's asking whether these are applicable to individuals who build rather than buy.
Okay, so if the question is about, it depends on what the question is about. So a lot of the subsidization of first-time buyers is only for buyers. The mortgage interest tax exemptions are for for mortgage interest for buyers, but of course that does filter through to builders. And if you're a builder and you bought land and you build and you've taken mortgage out on the land, then it would also apply to you. And if you are including in that some renovations that would meet the specifications for forgivable loans, home improvements, then it would apply to you too. The municipalities also have programs. They're quite variable, but they have programs which would maybe give you an exemption if you are providing access that is for disabled people or something like that. So that might apply. If the question is about the various mortgage lending subsidies from the federal government, then it's often only for buyers, but it includes speculators. And if a builder is also a speculator, like buying up other properties, whatever, so that could apply. So there's a possibility there. And then we have some of the the other things I mentioned. CMHC lending does apply to builders. Land privatizations do apply to builders, et cetera. So in that sense, those would apply to builders as well as buyers. So hopefully it's a complex answer to that question.
Thank you. Melissa had a question. I don't know. you want to speak it, Melissa, but in the chat, can you explain how the government gives banks money? Like, how is that justified?
I mean, and I think when what I was thinking, and maybe I was a bit confused, is that Alan, you said that, well, then they just give the money, but I think that was actually in the context of buying bonds, or the like buying the mortgages from banks. I don't think you actually meant that. I can't hear it. I find that all of the stuff around banks really confusing because I don't know, like, yes, banks are independent of the government, but their relationship is so tight, and so just that's the one piece of this that I just find kind of confusing and overwhelming, and I know that it's really important, but anyway, I'll stop talking. I don't know what my question is basically it. We could probably move on.
Yeah, so I have a couple of slides. Maybe I'll show them, and this might make it a little bit easier to understand. Hopefully. I think that this is the thing that most people don't understand. Even I talk to economists, and they don't even know this program exists, the Canada Mortgage Bonds. They have no idea, right? They think, oh, demand and supply. If prices are high, people can afford it. So what's the issue? Like there's a U of T economist who has, at meetings and say, well, I challenge the idea that housing is not affordable because people are buying. But a big question is like, who is buying it and how they're getting the money. Anyway, so these are two slides that I show in a lecture in a course that I teach at the University of Toronto. And it compares the old process of mortgage lending to the new process. So hopefully this helps. So in the old process, a bank would issue a mortgage. That mortgage then the money would go to the borrower, and the borrower would pay back the bank, right? So it's like this loop. Because the bank is getting paid back directly by the borrower, then the bank has an interest in making sure that when they lend the money, it's going to get paid back. So they're careful with who they lend to. They want to make sure they're not, lending to someone's risky. This often meant they didn't lend to speculators who had multiple properties, because, a speculator has 10 properties, whatever, if they've leveraged each property each time, then, they get into trouble, whatever, there's a crisis, there's a recession, suddenly they won't be able to pay back the loans on any of the properties. So banks are like a bit more reticent to do that. They rather lend to home buyers who have an interest in making sure they pay back the loans. But under the financialized system of lending, that's no longer the case. So the bank issues a mortgage. That mortgage then goes to the borrower, right? So the money goes to the borrower. But instead of the borrower paying back the bank, the borrower doesn't do that. They're paying their mortgage payments go to whoever has bought the mortgage-backed security. So the mortgage itself, the piece of paper, is packaged with other mortgage and a mortgage-backed security, and then that mortgage-backed security is sold. Now in Canada, in the US, I should say, in other places where these are mostly private label, they might be just sold directly to a pension fund, or they're sold to a special purpose vehicle or something like that was created by one of the Wall Street banks to funnel money to investors. But in Canada, most of the time, these mortgage-backed securities are sold to something called the Canada Housing Trust, which was created by CMHC. It's an arm's length thing of CMHC, and it holds the mortgage-backed securities in trust. And so it's kind of this odd system that we have in Canada. When the borrower pays back their loan, they're actually paying back the Canada Housing Trust. And the Canada Housing Trust is then funneling money to the investors who have bought the Canada mortgage bonds from the Canada Housing Trust. So what they do, so this green square down here, these are the investors, let's say a pension fund. They buy a bond, Canada Mortgage Bond. It's sold by the Canada Housing Trust, which is arm's length institution of the CMHC, created by the federal government. And when they buy that money goes to the Canada Housing Trust, and that money has to be spent buying mortgage-backed securities from Canada's lenders. That means that the banks, they have to find mortgages to issue to people that they then package in a mortgage-backed security so that they can sell it to the Canada Housing Trust. The more Canada mortgage bonds are created by the Canada Housing Trust and then sold to pension funds, the more that there's a demand for mortgage-backed securities. So the banks are incentivized to lend to more and more people to issue more and more mortgages, put them in mortgage-backed securities, and sell them to the Canada Housing Trust. So when the federal government says, we're going to increase the number of Canada mortgage bonds that we issue every year from 30 billion to 60 billion, that's another $30 billion that they want to spend buying up mortgages. That's incentivizing the banks to try and find anybody they possibly can to lend money to. That, you know, and when in a situation like, say, the last 2 years where, you know, everyday home buyers don't have the ability to afford the prices that are out there, then what it's doing is incentivizing the banks to lend to speculators. Because the speculators, you know, it's a business model for them. When interest rates go down, sure, I can make some money on this. I'll either hold it to flip or I'll hold it and rent it out in Airbnb or something. And so the banks are really incentivized to lend. So the banks don't hold the mortgages anymore. They lend the money and put it in, they put it in a mortgage. The mortgage is packaged in a mortgage-backed security and then sold on to the Canada Housing Trust. Because the bank is no longer holding the mortgage, they're not really caring if the borrower can pay it back. They lend anyone, they lend to speculators, et cetera, it doesn't matter. They get paid by the Canada Housing Trust for those mortgages when they put them in a mortgage-backed security. So literally the Canada Housing Trust, an arm's length federal institution created by the federal government as an arm's length part of CMHC, is giving the banks money. They are giving money in return for the banks handing them over a mortgage-backed security. And the more money that goes into the Canada Mortgage Bonds program, the more money gets given to the banks in return for those mortgages that they issue. Does that help explain how the system works? It's a very complex system. Most people don't understand it, but it's extremely pernicious.
I have another question related to this.
Yeah,
I'm just thinking about so obviously they're selling bonds because the investors can make money off of them. So how does that money flow? The different interests, like they're obviously the borrower is going to be paying interest, but it's not going to the bank. It's like with all of these kind of intermediaries, how does that money flow and how does it actually affect the borrower and rates?
Right. So the more that goes into the Canada Mortgage Bonds program, the more demand there is for mortgages. That is, the more demand for mortgages issued by the banks. Now, when there's more demand for those mortgages, then the interest rate will come down a little bit. So the more money flows into Canada Mortgage Bonds program, that is actually keeping interest rates from going up to what they might have other, you know, maybe it's keeping them lower by about half a percentage point or something than they would otherwise have been or something, right? So that means borrowers get a slightly lower interest rate loan than they would have otherwise, especially if the banks were holding the risk. They might even be even higher than that. So the borrowers is getting a loan, a mortgage, and they're paying back their loan. The interest and principal is going to the Canada Housing Trust to pay down the principal and interest of the mortgage, which is now packaged in a mortgage-backed security held by the Canada Housing Trust on behalf of investors, those pension funds. And they're paying that back. The bank is not getting that interest. The bank is getting paid upfront for the mortgage. And when they get paid upfront for the mortgage they issue, they're not getting, so let's say a bank issues a mortgage for $1 million. But say $1 million at 5% interest. They are not getting paid $1 million for that. They're getting paid the value of the loan amortized at 5% over 25 years. And so they're getting, you know, maybe 1.3 million or whatever it happens, 1.6 million, whatever it is. Haven't done the math right now. But whatever the math is, that represents the total value of that loan at, say, $1 million plus 5% interest over 25 years. So the bank is getting paid that immediately for issuing the mortgage. So the bank is actually making good money. They're like, you know, giving $1 million away, but they're making profits from that. So it's in their interest to do this. They love it. You know, they love the Canada Mortgage Bonds program. This is one of the reasons why Canada's banks are so powerful and strong, and they make massive profits, report massive profits every year, even when, you know, there might be talk of recession or, you know, the housing market softens or whatever. Because when they issue these loans, they're getting paid up front for the value of the loans. Now, there's something called a reverse auction when they do issue them. And when the demand is high, maybe they won't get the same quite as much as they might have otherwise got paid, for the mortgage if there's like, different buyers interested in purchasing that mortgage-backed security, like for instance, competition with the Canada Housing Trust but that typically happens in a rising boom time. When it's like now, when it's soft, it's probably just the Canada Housing Trust buying that mortgage. So the banks make really good profits off of this. And the Canada Housing Trust, on behalf of the federal government, holds the loan. Now, the Canada mortgage bonds that the investors have bought, so this green triangle, they get the full interest and principal paid. So it's guaranteed to them, just like a Canada Treasury bond. So a pension fund buys, a Treasury bond from the federal government. The federal government promises them the principal of the bond, so how much they borrowed, plus interest. And the same is true for investors in the Canada mortgage bonds. So the Canada Housing Trust has to pay that. Let's say $1 million plus 5% interest, even if the homeowner, the borrower, stops paying their mortgage. So the borrower gets in trouble. Maybe they took out a variable rate loan. It was at 5% when they first took it out, but because it's variable rate, it became 8% or 9% or something. And they said, I can't afford this anymore. They default on the loan. Well, the Canada Housing Trust is still giving the full payments of principal and interest to the investors as if the borrower is paying. But now there's a gap because the borrower isn't paying. The Canada Housing Trust has to make up that difference. Well, the Canada Housing Trust is created by the federal government. It's part and parcel of the larger, federal government payment system, Treasury. And if there's a gap, well, the federal government has to make up that gap through, they have to divert monies from other programs in order to make up the gap. So that's the worry. If there is a recession and people stop, or there's a housing crisis or something, and people stop paying their mortgage payments, the federal government will have to make up the difference. And as we've noted, there's roughly 327, this is before the pandemic. It's probably a lot more now because during the pandemic, people went crazy and borrowed tons of money, and the federal government supported that with lots of extra Canada mortgage bonds financing. So we're probably talking close to $500 billion of outstanding securitized credit. People stop paying their mortgages, the gap has to be made up by the federal government, and they're going to have to divert monies from healthcare and other kinds of things, or borrow more money at high interest rates on international markets. And in fact, the federal government announced in the
Alan, sorry, we have 1 minute left.
Oh, geez, sorry.
I just, and there's a couple of questions that I would love to get answers to, but I think maybe we'll have a follow-up session because you've given us sort of a really clear understanding that I appreciate of what is actually going on. And the questions that we have are really related to what would be possible. So maybe we can have a follow-up session about these questions with, what public banking, what could support public social housing, what are some of the ways that we could, understanding how it works, how can we make it work differently? So let's think of this as the first of two sessions. I really appreciate